So the next speaker I'd like to introduce today is Professor Ron Borland, who's a Professor in Health Behaviour in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne, where he's been since 2019 after 33 years at Cancer Council Victoria. So Professor Borland is a Chief Investigator with the Tobacco Endgame Centre of Research Excellence and the Interdisciplinary Tobacco Endgame Research Network. He's also a Principal Investigator with the International Tobacco Control Policy Evaluation Project and one of the leading tobacco control and smoking cessation researchers in Australia and internationally. Thanks, Ron.
Okay, thanks very much. What I want to do today is talk a little bit about support from smokers and recent ex-smokers for banning smoking. Before doing so, I'd like to thank the traditional owners of this particular land for allowing me to stand on it to present and to be here for this meeting. So what is the problem we're trying to solve? The rates of daily smoking are getting close to 10% in several Western countries, including Australia, and in fact are down around 5% in Sweden, which looks like being the first developed country to achieve the 5% goal that people set themselves. And I would say that the 5% goal is a terrible end-game goal. It should be less than 1%. The notion that we could have 5% of our population smoking something as deadly as cigarettes on a regular basis, I think is unconscionable. Even at 10%, it's still leading to huge health costs and will continue to lead to huge health costs at 5%. Thus, should we consider banning smoking? In a sense, that the very low nicotine alternative is in a way a de facto ban on smoking nicotine cigarettes, because the nicotine is what you're trying to get. It's like taking the alcohol out of wine and saying, well, we'll still allow you to drink wine, but there's no alcohol left in it. It's a form of prohibition in a slightly more palatable mode. But when we think about these options, we need to think about what smokers are thinking about these things. Are smokers prepared to countenance the idea that we could ban smoking? So the aims of this, as part of our ITC surveys, which as other people have mentioned are in 4 countries of the world, the ones we're talking about today: Australia, Canada, the US and England. England, because various bits of the UK have slightly different policies on tobacco, and therefore we're focusing on England rather than the UK as a whole. In 2018, we asked the question at the top: would you support or oppose a law that totally bans cigarettes and other smoked tobacco within 10 years? In 2020, we asked essentially the same start question, but changed the wording a little bit, but I don't think it's likely to have had any impact on people's responses. But the bit that's not in yellow after is the conditional, is a scenario under which the ban would take place. And in 2018, it was if the government provided assistance to help smokers quit. And in 2020, it was if the government encourages smokers to use alternative nicotine products like vaping products and nicotine replacement products instead. And note that the second one is getting the government to encourage people to use alternatives. So it's not about just providing them, but it's about encouraging, and that may be important. So the methods, as I said, they came from the surveys. They were adults over 18 who smoke cigarettes at least monthly, and I'm only going to be reporting the actual data from the smokers. Ex-smokers are considerably more supportive of these notions because it no longer affects them anymore, or they hope it won't affect them in the future because we know a percentage of them will relapse. The sample sizes were 10,000 in 2018, and less than half of that in 2020, because we only randomly asked half of our sample across the 4 countries. So the reason it's much lower is it was a random half the sample. They're broadly representative samples. There's some over sampling of people who are using alternative tobacco products, nicotine products, but the data I'm presenting are going to be weighted back to give reasonable population estimates, as reasonable as you can make them when you've got a not totally representative sample to start with. So, cessation focus. What level of support is there? Let's have a... Yeah. As you can see, there's considerably greater opposition than support, but there's over 30% of our respondents supporting, more likely to just support than strongly support, whereas with the cessation focus, there's at least as much strong opposition as there is less strident opposition. And unsurprisingly, for something that people may not have thought too much about, there's a considerable proportion, about 15%, who really just couldn't give us an answer at all. If you add the 15% to the support, you still get under 50%. So oppose and strongly oppose is more than 50% of smokers, which is not really surprising. So smokers don't support bans on smoking. Surprise, surprise. What is surprising is that there's a few who actually do. When we went to the alternative nicotine focus or scenario, we see a very similar pattern of responses. Some support, in this case less than 30%, similar levels of don't know, and opposition more clearly, more strongly opposing than opposing, which is a different pattern for support. And just to give you a sense of how those compare with each other, there is much more opposition to the alternative nicotine focus than to the cessation focus, and we can see that this varies a little bit across countries. So if you look at Canada, there was, in fact, Canadian smokers are more likely to support than oppose such a proposal for the cessation focus, but much more likely to oppose the alternative nicotine focus. In the US, much stronger opposition to the nicotine focus, but much less support for either proposal. Going to England, and England's a particularly interesting case because England's the one country which has had its National Health Services been providing smoking cessation services available to people. Not that a lot of people have actually used them, but they've been available for a number of years. And for the last few years, they've actually been promoting vaping as an alternative to, and other forms of alternative nicotine for people who haven't been able to quit using the approved methods. So in a sense, England has implemented both of these strategies to some degree without the ban on smoking, but it's implemented the conditionals. For England, you can see that the level of support opposition was fairly similar across the two countries, which is the only country for which that's the case. In the other countries, the opposition was much stronger against the nicotine focus and favouring the cessation focus. But you can see here that there's really much strong opposition in England to the cessation focus. So they've had a cessation focus without the ban, and in that context, they're not supporting a ban with a cessation focus, which may imply that they don't think the cessation focus is actually going to help. So that they just, having experienced it, they don't think it's going to be particularly useful. Similarly for the alternative nicotine focus, but to a lesser degree. In Australia, again, much higher opposition or to the nicotine focus or stronger support for the cessation focus. But again, not much in the way of differences in terms of strength of opposition. But so we have three countries where there's a big difference. they prefer the cessation focus to the alternative nicotine focus, but England's somewhat different, and they're much more strong in their opposition. Sorry, that's the cessation. I think we can skip through all of that. So what have we got? Just to summarise, we've got country differences. English smokers are relatively less interested in cessation scenario than nicotine one, although they're equally supportive of both, unlike other countries where the cessation focus is preferred. And as I said, England's the only country with a strong cessation service and support for alternative nicotine. So is that a meaningful difference? Is that contextual factor a likely cause of the difference in their pattern of responding? I think it's a plausible cause. Obviously, with this kind of data, you can't demonstrate that it's a real cause, but I think it's a plausible cause. Let's relate that to vaping beliefs and behaviour. And what we've then gone on to do is look to see who is supportive of each of the policies. What we've found is that vaping beliefs and behaviours were associated with greater relative support for the alternative nicotine focus, as might not be terribly surprising. And they're really the only things that differentiated people's support apart from country. So people who have a experience of vaping and had positive views about vaping were more likely to support the alternative nicotine focus as compared with everybody else. And those were belief in the utility of vaping to quit was associated with reduced support for the cessation scenario and greater support for the nicotine one. But, however, a positive, not on that slide, is that people who were current vapers were not differentially supportive or against the cessation focus, but were more supportive of the nicotine focus. Beliefs in the utility went in opposite directions. However, there was an overall those who held an overall positive opinion of vaping in the multivariable analysis where they were all included was associated with support for both scenarios. So people who saw vaping as a positive thing were more likely to support both scenarios. And here, this gives you the support as a function of vaping status. I meant to put that slide before the other one. Apologies. So you can see those people who were current vapers, basically they had the same support for the two options, but there's a really quite marked difference in the support for the cessation policy, which, as I should keep reminding you, was 2 years earlier. So the timing of the surveys is an issue which I'll come to in a little while. So what were some of the common relationships? Interestingly, US smokers were less supportive of both forms. US smokers, US people in general, seem to be less supportive of government intervention in anything. So I think it's a characteristic of the US population compared with the other three countries, rather than anything specifically due to vaping. But that, again, is my interpretation. And as you'll see, most of the stuff I'm saying is in fact my interpretation, because we can't demonstrate any true causality in any of this. Interestingly, females were less supportive of total bans than men. We saw some data earlier suggesting that for the very low nicotine alternative, women tended to be more supportive, but women were less supportive. That's interesting. I don't know why that's the case. We found young people were marginally supportive, especially compared with the oldest group we analysed, those 55 and above, which is not old, I should point out, but I'm biased in that respect. But that was a really small effect once we controlled for all the other things. It was quite a strong effect as a bivariate association, but a quite weak effect in the multivariable analysis. There was no relationship with education. People with a high income were marginally more supportive, but it was a very small effect. but statistically just significant, and those people who refuse to state their income. You have about 10 to 15% of people in any survey, if you ask them what their income is, they'll tell you they don't want to tell you. And they seem to be quite a distinctive group of people who have a distinctive set of attitudes which are not quite related to socioeconomic status, but they're kind of interesting anyhow. The other thing, those people who reported being financially stressed, that was having trouble paying bills and things like that, were more supportive. So the notion that cigarettes are causing me a lot of financial stress, I'm more likely to be supportive, makes sense. Other relationships, we found no or little independent relationships for any of our measures of dependence. Things like smoking frequency, urges to smoke. So you might have expected people who are more dependent on smoking would be less likely to be supportive, but we didn't find anything in the multivariate analysis. However, people who had a negative opinion of smoking were more supportive of both policies. So something about it being generally bad. Support by motivation to quit, just to put some real data up to show that we actually had real data in this case rather than just reporting the effects. People who reported that they wanted to quit a lot, even in the multivariable analysis, were 4 times as likely to support each of the 2 scenarios at a similar kind of level, and there was a dose-response relationship. We found a similar relationship for their plans to quit. The closer they were to quitting, the more supportive they were, but the effect size wasn't as strong as for wanting to quit. But these were 2 independent effects of both of those being in at the same time. So both planning and wanting to quit have independent relationships. One of the things that really surprised us is that we asked people about recent NRT use. This is over the previous 2-year period, either for a quit attempt or for any other reason. People who'd used any NRT were much more likely to be supportive of both policies. The difference between those 2 is not significant, but marginally more supportive of the nicotine scenario than the cessation scenario. But we did mention NRT in the nicotine scenario. But that suggests that experience of nicotine products makes you more supportive of a ban, and these people have all, by definition, failed to quit using these products. So it's not as if that they see them as being miracle products, but the fact that they've had that experience is being supportive. Oh, sorry, I meant to mention moderate levels of cessation efficacy were also associated rather weakly. People who are highly confident in their ability to quit weren't as supportive. People who had no confidence in their ability to quit were not supportive. It was the people in the middle who seemed to be more supportive, and again for both policies. So what does it all mean? Opposition, overall opposition is greater and stronger. It's less the case in Canada. So if it was to happen anywhere, it might happen in Canada. The cessation scenario is prepared to the nicotine scenario, except in England, where both scenarios are part of a national approach. And arguably, as I've said, they see the 2 as similar, so we're not getting much difference between the 2. Whereas in the other countries, the cessation approach is one that's been promoted widely, whereas encouraging people to use alternative nicotine focuses on the use of the alternative product and sort of de-emphasises the role of cessation. And I think we made a mistake in our questioning. We really should have had an option there of cessation help and or support for alternative forms of nicotine, which is what is likely to happen if there were to be a ban anywhere, and certainly the sort of thing that's going to be happening in New Zealand. So I think people don't like the idea of being pushed to another product. Some of them prefer being pushed to cessation, but I think we'd have greater support if we offered them both. But we haven't asked the question, so we really don't know the answer. The nicotine scenario, as I said, my under-emphasised cessation help. Then we asked the question, is some of this responding idealism or realism? So the extent of strong opposition suggests that some people are threatened by this. And in terms of those people who want to continue to smoke, and a percentage of smokers do, that's probably realistic. But what about the supporters? The fact that indices of dependence were unrelated to this, while quit interest and negative attitudes to smoking were related, suggests that some people were answering in terms of what they'd like the result to be, rather than what they might realistically think the result might be. So suggesting some people may be answering in idealistic terms. If that's the case, if such a policy was to be actually seriously considered and people started to think about it, it may be that the levels of support would decline considerably. And it's also likely that the questions have been responded to in different ways to the way in which they were intended. Just in terms of this, I just point out, this is some data that's currently under review, is that there's a significant proportion of people, smokers, who report that they want to continue to smoke. We asked people what ideally they'd like to be doing in a couple of years' time. And about 20% of people said that they would like to continue to smoke. Another 13 to 14% said they'd like to quit and switch to alternative nicotine products. Most people would like to quit without switching. So most smokers aspire to be non-smokers, but a significant minority don't. And many of those who aspire to be non-smokers have been trying and haven't succeeded. So it's questionable whether they'll actually be able to. So there is a group of people for whom there is likely to maintain strong opposition. Some smokers will be unable to quit. There are also large differences in prevalence by various forms of disadvantage, and many groups that are disadvantaged have more trouble staying quit. If you look at the success rates for trials with disadvantaged groups, the success rates tend to be typically considerably lower than those for the normal population. So what will these groups do? Some of them may move to the illicit market, or they'll seek harm-reduced alternatives if available, and they're really the only two options available to them apart from quitting smoking. And as I said, many of them will not be able to quit, so they will likely be seeking one of these two alternatives. Before I go on to that, the slide I forgot to put in is some of the other limitations of this study. This study was done, one question was asked in 2018, the second question was asked in 2020. Some of you may remember an event that started at the start of 2020. It had some minor impact on the world, killed nearly half as many people as were killed by tobacco that year, something called COVID, I think it was called. So it's possible that people's response to the COVID epidemic and all of the concerns about that may have had some impact on people's responding. In the context of people's concern about COVID, this was done in the relatively early months of COVID before we had any forms of vaccine or anything like that. So people were worried. There were lots of lockdowns of various things. So it may be some of the differences are due to that. But given the similar patterns of differences we've found, we suspect that most of it is actually real. So can we eliminate smoking? After 30 years of trying and a range of new cessation aids, most older smokers will never quit when they're healthy. Dying is the predominant means of successfully quitting smoking, and it's not one that I would want to promote. And still lots of young adults are taking it up in the face of beliefs about the harm. We've been very successful in stopping kids taking it up, but young adults we've been less successful in, and I think we need to have an increased focus on where young adults are in this domain. I personally think elimination is implausible. I think it's an extension of the war on drugs with a likely similar outcome, and it's likely to be strongly opposed by some of the people who are directly affected, even if supports are provided, although it has a plausibility about it that attracts some. Thank you, and this work is funded by a whole range of sources, and a plug for my book. So, any questions?
Do you have any questions in the audience for Ron? I've got a question. So do you think, there was also the Avali outbreak in 2019. Do you think that may have had any influence on people, thinking, why would you want to encourage people to use vaping products?
I think that's highly plausible. The Avali outcome problem, as people would know by now, was caused by vitamin E acetate being added as a filler to cannabis vaping, oil-based cannabis vaping liquids. It had nothing to do with nicotine vaping at all. Although there's been a lot of effort to muddy the waters around that. It's very clear that it's not associated with nicotine vaping, but it's been widely believed, including by many people in the public health community, that somehow it is related to nicotine vaping, but it's not. And yes, that's likely to have suppressed people's appreciation of the potential of nicotine vapes, and is likely to be contributing to something that's been happening before that happened, increased belief that nicotine vaping is at least as harmful as smoking, which is implausible if you know anything about toxicology and epidemiology, but is increasingly believed by people. So it's going to be one of the challenges I think that New Zealanders are going to face, that if people believe that the alternatives that you're making available to them are more harmful than the product that you're trying to restrict, that's going to make it very difficult to convince people that this is ideal public health policy.
And another limitation, obviously, is the question's got those two parts to it. Yeah. It's, do you support stopping, government banning tobacco products? Yeah. And then it's got, the two things, like one was with cessation supports provided, but the other one was encouraging people to use nicotine vaping products. So I can see that some people might just focus on that second part about encouraging use, and you might, if you're an adult with children, be quite concerned about the idea of governments encouraging uptake of vaping products. So I'm just thinking, in future iterations during the question, it would be really good to have one with no conditional, or even also a conditional on discouraging the use of all nicotine products and seeing how people respond.
Yes, that was the original proposal, that we actually did it as a step thing, but by the ITC survey is about 40-some minutes long, and there's an incredible fight to get questions in. And if you ask two questions, that's seen as... so they get squeezed back into one. So it was one of those phenomena where we got squeezed back. Another one is, and really I think if we're going to be asking a series of questions, we're much better asking them about the very low nicotine scenario, asking that straight, and then asking that about if you provide the various forms of support for it. But you might be right. If we ask people just a ban, I don't think we'd have very high levels of support.
We don't know.
Well, it's likely to be no higher than this, and likely less. But I don't think it's a viable policy anywhere, whereas the very low nicotine policy is clearly a viable policy because one government in the world has been prepared to legislate for it. So it's a viable policy, and I think we need to be getting a better understanding of how people might respond to it, rather than a scenario that is, I think, much less likely to happen, at least in the short term. And if the very low nicotine policy works, there's going to be no need to ban completely. If it doesn't work, banning completely would be even further off the agenda. So I can't see it being part of any viable or agenda into the future. But having studied it for the last little while, to say this is not something we should be thinking about anymore is not something that researchers tend to want to say, but I'm saying it anyhow.
Okay. Were there any other questions? Or we thank Ron and for his presentation, and we'll move on to the next speaker.